Have you ever wondered why Photoshop does not have a white balance tool in it? I mean, of all the tools, there's tons of tools in Photoshop, but where on earth is the white balance tool? The truth is there is no white balance tool in Photoshop. There is another tool though called the color balance tool. And while it isn't necessarily a white balancing tool, it does possess the same parameters that something like Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom would possess with the white balance adjustment that you have for your tint and your temperature. We're going to take a deep dive into the color balance tool in Photoshop and talk about how you use it because I think it's one of the most underutilized tools in Photoshop. Here is a photograph that I got off of Adobe stock, and you can tell that the white balance is clearly off on this, and this is how it came from Adobe stock. Looking at this image, it clearly was color graded to have a possible maybe vintage style effect to it. But if we look at it, the colors are extremely off. Now, if we were to edit this in Adobe Camera Raw, we would go to our basic settings, and from here, we could offset the amount of yellow that's in this image by moving this over closer to the blue. And then we might be able to add a little bit more magenta to it. But you see there's a problem here. We have a lot of cyan that's also coming through in this image, but we don't have a cyan slider here in our white balance adjustment. That's where color balance in Photoshop is actually a lot more advantageous than using something like the tint and temperature in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom. I'm going to open up the color balance tool. The color balance is an adjustment layer that you can find in your adjustment layers section under color balance. Now what you're going to see here is there is a drop down right here for your midtones. You can select your shadows and you can select your highlights. Now in each one of these individual areas, you're going to have a slider for cyan to red, magenta to green, and yellow to blue. Now this will take a little bit of training your eye to see color to understand how you're going to adjust this image using these sliders. And what we can use to help us with that is the color wheel. Now, the color wheel is a phenomenal tool to show us how certain sliders are going to react to one another. So looking at this, cyan and red are what they call complementary colors, blue and yellow are complementary colors, and green and magenta are complementary colors. Now, if we look at the color balance tool, we see cyan to red, magenta to green, yellow to blue. So essentially what's happening here is we get to adjust these color balance settings to add more yellow or more blue to our midtones, our highlights, and our shadows independently. What I want you to notice here is that these complementary colors coincide with the sliders. Meaning if you want to offset the amount of red that's in an image, you move the cyan. If you want to offset the amount of magenta in an image, you move to the green. If you want to offset the amount of yellow in an image, you move to blue. So looking at this image, let's start with our midtones. Let's start with the easy color. What's really glaring at us? I think it's yellow. So I'm going to move this over and add more blue to the image. As I add more blue to the image, I start to see that we have a lot of magenta in this image as well. So I'll move this over into the blues, and then I'll offset that amount of magenta that's in her face by moving this over into the greens. And now I can see that there's a lot of cyan in the image. So I'll move the red over. Okay, and I'll move that over just a little bit over there. That's just the midtones and the midtones alone. We're already getting some progress here. Now let's go over to our highlights. In the highlights section, I want to do the same concept. I'm going to move over to my blue in the highlight areas. I'm going to move over into the greens a slight bit to offset the magenta. And then I'm going to move over, looks like I might actually want a little bit of cyan in those highlight areas to offset the amount of red that's there. Now I'll go into my shadows. And then in my shadows, I'm going to go ahead and move this over to add a little bit more red to those shadows. And then I'm going to see what happens as I move this left and right. Sometimes all you have to do is push it really far left and right, and your eye will start to just say, okay, that looks good to me right about there. Okay. We'll do the same thing here in our shadows of our yellows. And we're going to add a little bit of blue to those shadows. So when we look at our color balance here, we effectively have fixed the white balance of this image by using the color balance tool and the color balance tool alone. Now I know what you're thinking, because you're probably like, well, Blake, we can do something very similar with something like the curves adjustment layer, can't we? Well, let's try it. In the curves adjustment layer, we're going to go ahead and put on a curve. You're going to see these little eyedroppers that are right here. This lets you select what you think what should be white in the image, what should be gray in the image, a mid-tone value, or what should be black. So if I take the white eyedropper and we say that her teeth, or maybe the whites of her eyes, need to be white. That is what this is going to say the white balance should be of this image. But you can see it also effectively increases the brightness of the image. So of course you could say, well, let's just offset that and make it just the color, not the luminosity. But things start to get funky and kind of wonky looking when we do that. Honestly, I find color balance to be a better way to adjust my white balance in Photoshop. If I'm working in Photoshop, I find this to be a better way to adjust my white balance. How does this pertain to raw images? This is after the fact. When I'm working with the raw image, I definitely prefer to work on that color at the raw level using the white balance in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom. However, because we're in Photoshop now, I'm showing you how to use that in Photoshop. Always try to get the color as correct as possible as you can in your raw software before trying to do it in Photoshop. So, okay, we've taken this image and we've effectively fixed the white balance for this photograph using color balance. We've compared that to what it might look like if we were to try to use the curves adjustment layer. Personally, I prefer this method with the color balance versus the curves adjustment layer, but you can try both. What I want to show you in this image is essentially how the color balance tool is working. So what I've done here is I've taken a breakdown of this image of what this photograph would look like in its highlight areas, its midtone areas, and its shadow areas by breaking them down into their independent areas in what would be like a posterized version. Now, with the color balance on top of this, this allows us to take a look at what's happening with our midtones. Well, our midtones in this image are particularly going to be the darker or the middle gray, like this gray, maybe even this gray. So as I move my green over, you can see that it's affecting the entire image both in the shadows and in the highlights, but it's predominantly affecting the midtones first. So there is going to be some bleed over between your midtones and your highlights. So as you adjust one, it's not just set in stone saying, well, this is a midtone and it has to be a midtone. It's actually allowing itself to bleed and feather into those highlights a little bit. So as you go into each individual slider and edit them independently, you're actually getting a much better adjustment because there is some bleed through. Now I'll go into the highlights. And in the highlights, let's go ahead and add some of this magenta here. So the reason why I did that was because you can see now where that overlap is. That even though we told the midtones get more green, we're now telling the highlights to get more magenta. So it's taking priority in those highlight areas and it's allowing some of those midtones to even be offset by the amount of magenta that's there, okay? Now we'll go into the shadows and we'll move this over in the, let's say the green area here. By adding more green to those shadow areas, what is taking preference? If we take this breakdown and we turn it off, it's gonna be a really nasty color grade. But it does allow us to see that in each individual drop down of those tonal ranges, there is some bleed over between what is a highlight and what is a midtone and what is a shadow. And this is an extreme look at it. But by using this example, it gives us a good demonstration as to what we can expect to see as we modify these sliders. Now, what I showed you here was using the color balance tool as a color corrective tool. What I want to show you here is how we can use the color balance tool as a color grading tool. So this would be something that would happen at the end of your workflow, something that you're saying, I like the way this looks. This is a beautiful shot at Rocky Mountain National Park overlooking the tundra area on top of Trail Ridge Road. Phenomenal sunset that we had there. But I want to color grade this to give it a little bit more of that magenta warmth feeling that we have from that sunset. So I'm going to add a color balance adjustment here. And in the color balance adjustment, I say to myself, well, if I move it to the green, I'm going to offset the amount of red that's in those rocks. So let me make that a little bit more magenta to warm this up a little bit. Let's make that a little bit more red, okay? And then let's see what happens when we make it more yellow or more blue. I kind of like what happens actually when we make it a little bit on the bluer side to incorporate some of that blue into those midtone areas. Now I'll go into the highlights. In the highlights, do I want to make them more magenta or more green? Well, I think they kind of benefit from a slight bit more green. They'll probably benefit from more yellow than that blue, because if we use blue, we're going to offset that sky, add yellow to it. And then they might benefit from a little bit more red in those highlight areas. Now let's take a look at our shadows. Now our shadows here, I get to decide if I want to cool those shadows down or warm those shadows up, depending on how strong I want this sunset to look. If I want this sunset to look really strong, I'll warm up those shadows. If I want it to be a little bit subdued in those shadow areas and just have it speak for itself within the midtones and the highlights, I'll move it towards the blue. These decisions that I'm making for warm and cool are what's going to invite the viewer into certain areas or tell them to kind of separate themselves from them. Typically, warm areas within a photograph are going to attract our attention and cooler areas are going to push us away a little bit. So let's make those a little bit more warm in those shadow areas. Now, what else controls warmth in those shadow areas? It would be the reds. If I do this though, I feel like there's almost too much red and yellow happening in the image, almost too much warmth. So let's taper this off a little bit in those shadow areas with the color red. And then let's see what happens when we add a little bit of magenta to those shadows. So let's make this a little bit larger and look at our before and after. Okay, so here's our before. I thought this image was great by itself, standing alone, right? I've got a beautiful sunset there, but none of the colors are really unified here. There's no color palette that is unifying the beautiful sunset that we have and these red rocks in the foreground. It almost feels a little bit separate. And part of that is becoming because of the coolness that's happening within those shadow areas. But if we add this color balance here, you can see how immediately when the viewer is brought in this image, there's a sense of warmth from that sunset. And that's what I felt when I was there. And that's what I want to incorporate into this piece. So I'm using color balance here to exaggerate the colors, not for color correction, but for color exaggeration. And this is the beauty of the color balance tool in Photoshop, is that it can be used for color correction or color exaggeration. At the end of the day, I think that this is a far superior way of working with your color than in Adobe Camera or Lightroom, because we also have to say why. Well, what do we have at our disposal here for any adjustment layer in Photoshop? Well, we have opacity. We can adjust how strong that is even after we've set these. We can drop this opacity a slight bit so it's not quite as strong. We have blend modes. Maybe we can change this to something like soft light to bring a lot of strength with that. Maybe even drop that opacity a little bit more if we wanted to as well. And then we have things like blend if, where we could say, I don't want this to affect the shadows quite as much. Now we can't do that in Adobe Camera or Lightroom. With our white balance adjustment, we get tint, temperature, and that's it. There's no opacity, there's no strength. It's just, this is it. We move the sliders and this is it. Your key takeaway to understanding color balance in Photoshop is going to be the color wheel, okay? Understanding that blue offsets yellow, yellow offsets blue. The idea here is that if you are trying to do color correction, you want to find the one color that jumps out at you first and foremost and says, hey, fix me. And then all the other colors start to fall in line. If you're trying to use this for exaggeration, you want to say to yourself, what am I trying to do for the viewer? Am I trying to bring them in and warm this image up? Or am I trying to cool it down to push them away or make it feel more calm? Now, there are pluses and minuses to both warmth and cool. A warm color will typically pull the viewer in because we want to go towards warmth, but it could also create a sense of anxiety if it's too warm. On the cool side of things, coolness will calm the viewer down, but if it's too cold, it will push the viewer away. Think of somnus when someone's blue or under the weather. This is not a one-trick pony tool. It's used for correction, used for exaggeration, and really bringing in the mood for your images. If you like what I've demonstrated here with color balance, click this playlist here. I've got a ton of videos on color and color alone. I love color grading and everything color theory. And if you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing. I like to take very difficult things in Photoshop and make them seem very simple so you can use them in your workflow today. Thank you for taking the time to watch this. I do sincerely appreciate it.